Thank you, Chair. Members to my register of interest. Good morning, Secretary of State.
James.
Now, possibly on this day, in what might be your last appearance as Secretary of State in anticipation of a reshuffle, the irony isn't lost on me that the government is in the High Court defending its record on SEND funding. The Local Government Association is on record as saying that the ring-fenced funding is £1.6 billion short. So what are you now doing differently on SEND as a government since you funded it last, and since Timpson, and since you came to position?
Well, James, you'll understand I can't comment on an ongoing court case, but on the subject overall, you will know that the 2014 reforms, this committee actually did pre-leg scrutiny on that important landmark legislation, Children and Families Act 2014, was the biggest set of reforms to SEN entitlements for a generation. And with the institution of EHCPs, Education, Health and Care Plans, and the wider entitlements post 18 in the 19 to 25 area, and various other reforms with which you will be familiar. So when you ask what are we doing differently, I mean that's has been a huge change. And my own experience, so as a constituency MP, so before I did this job, and in fact my local authority area was a so-called trailblazer area for those reforms before them coming in nationally, my own experience has been that actually it was a great improvement. Now we all know as constituency MPs we also meet parents, we meet families who are having a very difficult time with the system of battling to get the right support for their children, and I'm not belittling that point at all. We rightly as constituency MPs are support them in what they do. In terms of the resourcing, the high needs spend, as you'll probably know, has increased from it was £5 billion a few years ago. It's over £6 billion now, but there are strains and stresses on those budgets at local authority level.
So the challenge is, if I may, look, 5 years ago, that legislation, well intended, broadly supported. Certainly, I wasn't here, but I would support that, absolutely. The issue is not the intent and the good intent of the legislation. It's the impact and the rollout and the implementation of that. And the charge I would level at the government is that it's not a completer finisher. And what you haven't done is ensure that those entitlements were matched with resources and the capabilities to deliver on those rights that you enshrined in law. So you've raised expectations, you've raised entitlements, but then you've walked away. And whilst funding in cash terms as a number might be higher, the pressures are also bigger. And a shortfall, as I said to your colleague, half a bridge isn't much of a bridge. And the LGA is saying that there is a 1.6 billion shortfall on SEND provision. But it isn't just about funding, is it? So let's just illustrate the failure to act on implementing good intent. We've now a situation where 80% of tribunals brought by parents, over 90 now, my colleague says, thank you, over 90% of tribunals brought by parent groups are found in the favour of the parent, of excluded children, confirmed by the report that you commissioned, or the Prime Minister commissioned in Timpson. 80% of excluded pupils have SEND. We have an explosion of EHCP requests, 20% of which are turned down at application stage, not assessment stage. 1/5 of local authority testimony that we took sees them turn away at application stage, not assessment stage, which by my reckoning is unlawful. And so local authorities are duty-bound but hand-tied by your government because you failed to complete and finish the good intent of the 2014 Act. Now, that Act's 5 years old, but you've had 18 months in post, I think, there or thereabouts. I still don't see any difference. You talk about constituency MPs, they're still in tears because the local authorities in the region and around the table here would concur. They're still being let down by a lack of provision. Some of this isn't just about money. If I may finish, because I appreciate some of the charges, it's always about money. If you spend money, the money that is spent now further upstream at SEND provision, then the EHC plan explosion will not be occurring as regularly as it is. There's quite a lot in there, but I believe you're up to responding to it.
Thank you, James. There are more EHCPs than there were statements. I mean, actually, quite a lot more. And so, at the heart of what you say, there is an important truth. So, resourcing has increased, and it has increased actually substantially. But there are also particular pressures. That is why in December I put in place a package over 2 years. I'm not suggesting this solves the problem, because they've got to come back to all these points when it comes to the comprehensive spending review. That's the mechanism by which spending is allocated across all government departments. But in December we put in place a package over 2 years of £250 million in revenue funding for local authorities. A further, and you're right to say it's not only about the cash. It's also about the availability of places, making sure that every child can get the setting that's right for them. Quite often that is in a mainstream school. Actually, what we've seen is more kids go the opposite. Actually, what people think. Most people think there is a process of mainstreaming going on. In fact, there's more children going into special schools. And quite often then from a local... Hang on, you asked me a very long question, James. And then quite often then the state special schools become full. And so there's more children then are going into independent sector special schools, and quite often there's transport attached to that as well. So as well as the £250 million revenue support, we've also put in place £100 million of capital to do things like support inclusion units in mainstream schools. We're going to recruit and train more ed psychs, because we know that's a really, really important part of the chain. We've got a current consultation, I think it's still open, a current consultation on the way that the funding system works, and particularly, the first £6,000 principle and how that's working in the school system, and if it could be better and further work on joint commissioning and so on. So I accept what's at the kernel of what you say, that yes, there are more children with EHCPs. We could have another discussion about why that is, and maybe something you want to come on to. We do need to make sure that's properly resourced. We have put in place more resourcing, but we also need to think about all the other aspects.
Look, I mean, the point is that councils have been left unable to fulfil their responsibilities as determined by the Act. The Act itself it predicates the continuation of these children in mainstream schools. That's why it is a welcome piece of legislation.
Sorry, it does what?
So it's predicated on the assumption that these children stay in mainstream schools, rather than what has actually happened, as you've said, is that they are increasingly...
No, it's not predicated on that. It should be the right setting
the premise,
child.
yeah. But well, I think it does more than that. I think it affirms mainstream schooling as a right for children with special educational needs.
I see what you mean. So that's a different point. But yeah.
So we agree on that. Okay, fine. And yet what we've seen is a rise of exclusions, highest represented group being those with SEND, and schools and local authorities duty-bound but also hand-tied to be able to discharge their responsibilities of the Act. I would see that there would be far more, or there is far more you could do to interact with that system and see that spending is far better spent at SEND mainstream school level. What we see is a magnet for EHCP, to the point of the unlawful practice now where local authorities at 20% levels, 1/5 of all applications, are refused out of hand. Would you agree that that practice is unlawful according to the legislation?
No, I mean, I'd need to see more about exactly what you're talking about, and I'm happy to do that by correspondence.
So the legislation, the guidance to the legislation says it's your government's legislation, but the guidance to that legislation says that if you apply for an EHCP, you should be assessed.
Yes.
What we have now is that applications are refused out of hand. That 20% is based on the testimony we've taken through our inquiry.
So I would need to understand a lot in much more depth and on paper what exactly the suggestion is and the analysis is, and I'd be happy to follow up on that. On your broader question, look, I agree with you that we do need to continue to look at and evolve practice. Of course I do. I do want to correct you on exclusions. You said exclusions have been rising. That is true the last few years, but of course the rate of permanent exclusions is still lower than it was 10 years ago.
And what is the proportionate number of those with SEND within that figure? Because that's now at over 80% confirmed by Timpson. So the idea is that you presided over a system that is narrowing its curriculum, increasing expectations on schools that then in turn exclude children who don't cut the mustard according to your ever narrowing set of criteria for inspection.
I think that's a colossal generalisation, James, and not fair on teachers and head teachers.
Well, let's go back to a specific...
No, whoa. Head teachers do not expel children willy-nilly. In my experience, the expulsion of a child is something you do after all other options have been exhausted.
So what?
Sometimes it is necessary, because you also have to think of all the other.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Secretary of State. You turn to the point of other. Why then are 20% of all the children that are expelled? You know nothing about the reason for them being expelled. Well, 1/5 of all expelled children, you have no information.
I heard the question mark at the end of the sentence. So
I've not heard the
answer. We know a lot more
yet
about expelled children as a result of commissioning the Timpson review and the very good work, very deep analytical work that Edward and the team did. It asked some difficult questions, and that was the point of doing it. So as I say, we know more than we have done in the past, and yes, we need to make sure that everybody is being treated fairly. But it is also true that the rate of permanent exclusion at 0.10% on the last count is lower than it was a decade ago.
But what more do you know within that other figure, of which 1/5 of all children that are expelled, 80% plus of which are represented highest with SEND needs? What more information do you know about that category?
James, you'll have to help me further with the question.
Even more detailed then. Since Timpson identified that 20% of all excluded children, a figure that I was citing for some time before it confirmed, since then, what have you done to our schools as to what some of those reasons are?
Well, look, as a result of the Timpson report, I think there's 30 recommendations. We accept, in principle, those recommendations. James, it's in the nature of government policy and implementation, as you know, that you need to do these things. You need to do these things with care. Some of them also involve other bodies, like Ofsted, for example, which will have a role in looking at these things, who care very much about inclusion. And the Timpson report will continue to inform development of policy and practice.
And some of Timpson's recommendations, as you know, address data and ask schools and other partners locally to look at the data, ask themselves questions about what's going on in the system. And in my experience, when you get a growth of other, actually it's because nobody's looking at the data and nobody's reflecting on it. So part of the review and the recommendations and the follow-up we're doing is exactly to sort of get that discussion going on the ground.
I would just counsel, finally, Chair, I would just counsel that it is also a place to put reasons that are explicitly inconvenient, or that just are not being acknowledged as a reason why schools are off-rolling, excluding, with the highest proportion of category being SEND. And I think that's a valid charge on the government, because whilst the 0.01% that you referred to, Secretary said, is a fair point, if actually the highest proportion are those children who are most vulnerable and most in need of specialist education. Yes. I think that's a hell of a job to crack on with, and I don't see the evidence of that bar the acknowledging of it as an issue.
James, a quick question.
Yeah, quick question about capital funding, Secretary of State. Can you confirm that the condition data collection, which is this review of the school estate being undertaken under Lord Agnew, will that programme rather be publicly available, i.e. will the list of schools that have been assessed and their condition be publicly available, as I understand it has been before through the Priority Schools programme? Derby High and Tottington High, for one, in my constituency, hope that they'll be on the list and very high up it, because their schools should be 10 years old and they're rebuilt by now.
So on the specific question of will the list, I don't know. I have no reason to believe practice will be any different from how it has been in the past, but I'm happy to come back to you.
Thank you. Secretary, on T levels, Bury College is one of the early colleges. How can they best take advantage of being an early adopter of T levels when the chair of the Social Mobility Commission last week said that she thinks that the government should still defer it and delay the launch of T levels? That sounded a bit like a composite motion, James, if you don't mind me saying so. I'm not sure quite how those things all fit together. A composite answer would do.
I'll happily give you a straightforward answer. I mean, I think it's brilliant that Bury College is going to be one of the earliest institutions offering T levels. It's a really exciting opportunity for young people. And we're working closely in partnership with all the colleges and other settings that are doing it, including with Bury, and I look forward to carrying on.